He had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The week had been long, filled with meetings, phone calls, and the constant buzz of city life that never seemed to pause. All he wanted was a quiet place to breathe, a cabin by the lake where the water lapped gently against the shore, and the only sound was the wind through the trees. The small wooden cabin he had rented years ago had become a sanctuary, a place where the noise and stress of everyday life could melt away. It was modest, but it had a charm that nothing in the city could match. The lake shimmered under the early morning sun, birds flitted from tree to tree, and he could almost feel the tension leaving his shoulders. Before he even stepped out of the car, he pulled his things from the back of the car, loading the small wagon he used for weekend trips. Every item had a place, every bag a purpose. He liked things neat, organized, and ready for a peaceful weekend. As he approached the cabin, he noticed the familiar creak of the dock under his feet and the reflection of the trees in the still water. Everything looked normal, perfect even. He had spent countless weekends here, and it had always felt like his own little piece of heaven. That is, until today. There was a small envelope tucked under the doormat. At first he thought it might be a friendly note from a neighbor or a receipt from the maintenance crew. But the stark white envelope with official-looking letters made him pause. He bent down and picked it up. His heart sank the moment he saw the words on the front, a notice from the Lake Authority. He had dealt with minor annoyances before, small fines for parking too close to the dock or warnings about boat safety, but this seemed different. He opened it carefully, not wanting to rip anything. But the words jumped out at him immediately. A $500 fine for an alleged violation regarding lake access. He read it again, slowly, hoping his eyes had deceived him. The letter stated that he had improperly used lake facilities and had violated local regulations. No specifics, no prior warning, just a firm statement and a deadline to pay or face further penalties. He felt his stomach twist. He had always followed the rules, always made sure to check notices and follow guidelines. How could this be happening now? It felt personal, unfair, and confusing all at once. He stared at the envelope in disbelief, the words blurring together as his mind raced. He went back to the cabin and sat down at the small kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through the window, hitting the wood in a warm glow that should have been comforting, but he could barely focus on it. His hand shook slightly as he reread the notice. There were instructions on where to pay, a contact number for questions, and a warning that ignoring the fine could lead to legal action. Each line felt like a punch in the gut. $500 might not seem like a huge amount to some people, but it was the principle of it. It was sudden, unexplained, and felt like an attack on something he cared about deeply. His peaceful retreat, his small sanctuary. He picked up the phone and dialed the number listed on the notice. It rang several times before a recorded voice came on, directing him to press buttons for different departments. He followed the prompts, each one taking him further from a real person, further from an answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, someone picked up, double quotes, "Yes, this is the office," a crisp voice said. It was polite, professional, but there was no warmth in it. "Hello," he began carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "I received a notice for a $500 fine regarding lake access. I'm confused because I've always followed the rules. Can you explain what this is about?" There was a pause, a brief silence on the other end, and then the voice spoke again, almost as if reading from a script. "You are being fined for violating lake regulations. The specific details are available in the official notice. You must pay the fine or face additional penalties." He swallowed hard. "I have the notice right here, but it doesn't explain what I did wrong. Can someone clarify? I want to resolve this." Another pause. "All information regarding violations is listed in the notice. You may pay the fine or appeal through the proper channels." That was it. No explanation, no details, just a firm reiteration of what he already knew. He hung up the phone, feeling a mix of frustration, disbelief, and anger. How could a system operate this way? How could people enforce rules without clarity, without transparency? It seemed like an impossible situation, and yet here he was, facing the threat of a fine and possible legal action for something he didn't even understand. He walked outside, trying to clear his mind. The sun reflected off the lake, the gentle ripples creating a soft, hypnotic rhythm. The birds sang their songs, oblivious to human worries. For a moment, he let himself breathe, let himself forget about the letter and the fine. But it lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, disbelief, helplessness, and a strange sense of determination beginning to take root. He wasn't going to pay a fine for something he hadn't done, not without understanding it first. He spent the next few hours pacing the dock, going over every possible rule he might have accidentally violated. He checked the cabin paperwork, reviewed emails from the lake authority, and even dug through old letters from neighbors. Nothing. Nothing at all. Everything he had done had been by the book. Yet here was a fine, official, and threatening, hanging over him like a dark cloud. By late afternoon, he realized he needed to talk to someone face to face. He drove to the local office, taking in the familiar sights of the small town along the way. The trees lining the roads, the occasional deer crossing the fields, and the quiet hum of rural life all contrasted sharply with the tension he felt inside. When he arrived at the office, he was greeted by a receptionist who gave him a polite smile, but did little to ease his worry. "I'm here about a fine," he said, handing over the notice. "I need to understand why it was issued. Can someone explain this to me?" She looked at the envelope briefly, then picked up the phone and spoke into it for a moment before turning back. "You'll need to speak with Mr. Dalton. He handles violations." He waited in the small waiting area, the minutes stretching on longer than he expected. Other people came and went, but he was too focused on the upcoming conversation to notice much else. Finally, a man in a crisp uniform appeared. He introduced himself as Mr. Dalton, his expression neutral, almost unreadable. "I received this notice," he began carefully, "and I would like to understand what I supposedly did wrong." Mr. Dalton scanned the paper, nodding slowly. "According to our records, you violated lake access rules. The fine is $500. There is no further explanation in the records. You may appeal if you wish, but the fine stands." He felt his jaw tighten. "No explanation at all? Not even the rule I supposedly broke?" Mr. Dalton shook his head. "All information is in the official notice. If you want specifics, you must file a formal appeal." The conversation left him reeling. He had faced bureaucracies before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about procedure. It felt personal, arbitrary, almost punitive. The thought that someone could issue a fine, restrict his access to the lake, and offer no explanation at all was infuriating. He left the office, a storm of thoughts in his mind. Driving back to the cabin, he replayed the day over and over in his head. The fine wasn't just money, it was a challenge, a threat to the peace he cherished. And with each mile, a plan began to form. He would not let this go unanswered. He would not pay for something he hadn't done. He would not be intimidated by an opaque system with no accountability. Back at the cabin, he sat quietly, letting the lake calm him. But his mind raced with possibilities. He needed to document everything, gather evidence, understand the rules better than anyone else, and find a way to turn this situation around. Anger was a powerful motivator, but strategy would be his tool. He realized he could approach this not just as a fight for justice, but as an opportunity to show that clarity, patience, and persistence could outmatch arbitrary authority. The evening fell, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The lake reflected the colors, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore reminded him why he loved this place. The fine was still there, the threat still looming, but he felt a spark of determination. He would not let a $500 fine take away his peace or his rights. This was the beginning of something more than a weekend retreat. It was the start of a personal mission. As darkness settled and the stars began to dot the night sky, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would begin researching the lake regulations in detail. He would review land records, past violations, any loopholes or inconsistencies that could help him understand the situation fully. He would be calm, methodical, and careful. This was not the end of the story. It was just the first chapter in a weekend that would test his patience, his intelligence, and ultimately, his ability to reclaim what was rightfully his. He sat on the porch, sipping a cup of tea, listening to the gentle hum of the lake at night. The fine felt smaller in that moment, almost insignificant compared to the quiet determination building inside him. The stars above were clear, the air crisp, and for the first time since receiving the letter, he felt a sense of control. The fight was not over. It was only beginning, and he intended to see it through. The next morning, he woke up before sunrise. The lake was quiet, shrouded in a soft mist that made everything feel almost magical. Normally, mornings like this were for coffee on the porch and the gentle hum of nature, but today his mind was restless. The fine from yesterday still loomed large in his thoughts. He knew that reacting impulsively would only make things worse. This was a challenge that required patience, observation, and strategy. He brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat on the porch, watching the water shimmer in the morning light. He thought about what had happened the day before. The $500 fine was arbitrary, unfair, and felt personal. He remembered Mr. Dalton's cold, scripted words, and the dismissive tone of the receptionist. It wasn't just about the money, it was about being treated as though he had no rights, no voice, and no ability to defend himself. That feeling of powerlessness was the worst part. He had to turn it around. But he needed information first. He spent the morning reviewing his notes and any paperwork he had regarding the lake rules. There were pamphlets, old notices, emails, and letters. He had always tried to follow every regulation, even the small ones that seemed unnecessary. Yet none of these documents mentioned the specific rule he had supposedly broken. Frustration bubbled inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Rushing in without understanding the situation could make it worse. After breakfast, he decided to walk along the lake and observe. He wanted to see if there were any new signs, notices, or restricted areas that he might have overlooked. As he walked, he noticed neighbors whispering among themselves. Some glanced at him with a curious look, while others seemed uncomfortable. He realized that news of the fine had probably spread quickly. People were forming opinions without knowing the full story, and that made the situation even more stressful. The fine was no longer just a personal matter. It had become public in a small community where everyone knew everyone. He continued along the shore, noticing the small docks, boats, and cabins along the water. Everything seemed normal, yet the tension in the air was unmistakable. It was as if the lake itself had shifted. Places he had once felt completely comfortable now felt like a stage where he was being watched, judged, and scrutinized. But he refused to let fear or embarrassment control him. He reminded himself that knowledge was power, and observation was the first step toward reclaiming his rights. By mid-morning, he decided to return to the cabin and make a plan. He pulled out a notebook and began listing every possible approach, reviewing regulations in detail, documenting the fine and all interactions with the lake authority, speaking to neighbors who might have information, and considering legal advice if necessary. Each step felt like a small piece of armor in preparation for a larger battle. He had to be meticulous. He had to be smart. And most importantly, he had to remain calm. Around noon, he decided to check on the dock. It had been untouched for years, but the previous day's events had made him uneasy. As he approached, he noticed something unusual. A small notice had been stapled to the post, written in official-looking letters. It was another warning. This time, it stated that access to the dock could be restricted if further violations occurred. He felt a wave of anger rise inside him. Not only had they issued a fine without explanation, but now they were threatening him further, trying to intimidate him. He carefully removed the notice and placed it in his notebook. He needed a record of everything. Every interaction, every warning, every notice could be useful later. He realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. The lake authorities seemed determined to assert control, and he would need to be just as determined to respond. But unlike them, he would do it with patience, planning, and intelligence. Later in the afternoon, he decided to speak with some neighbors who had lived around the lake for a long time. He needed to understand if anyone else had experienced similar fines or threats, As he walked to the nearest cabin, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The neighbors were initially hesitant to speak. The fear of the lake authority was real, and many people preferred to stay quiet rather than risk confrontation. But after some gentle conversation, a few shared their experiences. One neighbor mentioned that a few years ago, a couple of cabin owners had received fines for minor infractions that were never clearly defined. Another spoke of signs posted without explanation and docks closed without warning. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The lake authority had a reputation for being strict, rigid, and sometimes arbitrary. It wasn't personal, it was systemic, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. He realized he wasn't alone. That knowledge gave him a small sense of reassurance. By evening, he returned to the cabin, tired but mentally sharper. He decided to compile everything he had learned so far: the notices, conversations with neighbors, and his own observations. He spread them out on the table like pieces of a puzzle. Each document, each note, each memory was a piece of evidence. He knew that this careful documentation would be crucial if he wanted to challenge the fine. He also knew that approaching the situation with anger alone would only make things worse. Patience and preparation would be his allies. As night fell, he sat by the window, looking out at the dark, still lake. The moon reflected on the water, casting a silver glow that made the scene almost ethereal. Normally, this view would have calmed him completely, but tonight it served as a reminder. The fine was still unresolved. The dock notice was still there. The whispers of neighbors and the looming presence of the lake authority created tension that refused to be ignored. But he was no longer feeling helpless. He was forming a plan. He decided that tomorrow would be the day for research. He would visit the town hall, examine land records, and review historical rules regarding lake access. If the authority had been applying rules arbitrarily, he wanted to uncover it. If there were inconsistencies, loopholes, or errors, he intended to document them. Every action would be deliberate, every step methodical. He reminded himself that quiet intelligence often outperformed loud anger. The lake might seem calm, but beneath the surface, currents ran strong. He needed to navigate them carefully. Before going to bed, he made one final call. He wanted to confirm what he could about the appeal process, even if it was vague. The phone call was short, the answers minimal, but he noted down everything. Each conversation, each detail, each tiny fact was like another tool in his arsenal. He felt a sense of control beginning to return. The fine still existed, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable threat. With knowledge, preparation, and careful observation, he could face this challenge head-on. He fell asleep to the sound of the lake, the gentle lapping of water against the shore soothing his mind. Yet even in sleep, thoughts of the fine and the authority lingered. Dreams of docks, notices, and quiet confrontations played through his mind. It was as though the lake itself was calling him to action, demanding patience, intelligence, and careful strategy. He knew that the days ahead would not be simple, but he felt ready. For the first time since the notice arrived, he felt a quiet sense of determination that outweighed fear or frustration. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, casting a golden glow over the trees and water. He stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. Today, he would begin gathering the evidence he needed. Today, he would study the rules, document every detail, and learn everything possible about the lake authority and their procedures. He would speak to more neighbors, observe the docks, and ensure that nothing was overlooked. The fight was not about confrontation, it was about preparation, clarity, and justice. Walking along the shore, he noticed the stillness of the lake, the birds hopping from tree to tree, and the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the surface. The world seemed calm, almost untouched by human disputes. And yet, beneath that calm, he could feel the tension of yesterday's events simmering. It was not fear, it was focus. Every step, every observation, every detail mattered. He was learning patience, observation, and the art of quiet strategy. By late afternoon, he had mapped out his plan in detail. He would start with research at the town hall, then move to land and lake records, followed by careful documentation of all notices and interactions. He would record dates, times, and names. Every detail could be important later. He would also continue speaking with neighbors, but cautiously, so as not to reveal his full intentions. The fine had awakened something inside him, a determination to not just protect his rights, but to reclaim control over a situation that had been thrust upon him. As evening approached, he sat on the porch with a notebook in hand. The lake glimmered in the fading light, the reflection of the trees creating a sense of quiet symmetry. He thought about the lake authority, about the notices, and about the $500 fine. It had started as a simple, arbitrary punishment, but now it was much more. It was a challenge, a test of patience, strategy, and intelligence. He felt ready to meet it. The fight was quiet, methodical, deliberate. The stars began to appear in the night sky, scattered like diamonds above the still water. He sipped his tea slowly, feeling a sense of calm determination. The fine had tried to shake him, to intimidate him, but he refused to be shaken. He would respond not with anger, but with intelligence. The lake was still his sanctuary, and he intended to protect it with everything he had. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. He would study, observe, document, and prepare. The lake authority might think they held the power, but he was about to show that patience, knowledge, and careful planning could change the game entirely. The weekend that had begun as a peaceful escape was turning into a test of resilience, strategy, and quiet determination, and he was ready to face it head-on. The following morning, he woke with a sense of purpose. The events of the past 2 days had stirred something deep inside him, a combination of frustration, determination, and curiosity. He no longer felt like a victim of the $500 fine. Instead, he felt like someone who needed to understand the full story before responding. Today was the day for research observation, and uncovering the truth about the lake authority and the rules they enforced. He brewed a cup of coffee. Watching the mist rise off the water, the lake seemed calm and peaceful, but beneath that surface, he knew tension and conflict awaited. He needed to approach this calmly and systematically. First, he reviewed his notes from the previous day, everything from the letters, phone calls, and conversations with neighbors. He organized them carefully, highlighting details that could help him later. Dates, times, names, and notices of it mattered. He realized that keeping detailed records could be his strongest tool. After breakfast, he loaded his backpack with notebooks, pens, and a camera. He wanted to document everything he saw. Today, he would visit the town hall to examine lake regulations, past violations, and historical records. He would take notes and photographs wherever possible, building a clear picture of how rules had been applied over time. His mind raced with possibilities. If he could uncover inconsistencies, errors, or loopholes, he could not only challenge his fine, but also protect himself from future arbitrary actions. The drive to town was quiet, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across the road. He noticed familiar faces in the small-town shopkeepers, neighbors, and people tending to gardens. Some greeted him with polite nods. Others glanced curiously, aware of the ongoing situation with the lake. Word traveled fast in small towns, and he had to be cautious. While he needed information, he could not let the lake authority learn of his intentions too soon. At the town hall, he approached the records department. The clerk looked up from a stack of papers and gave him a neutral nod. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I'm researching lake regulations and past violations," he replied. "I need to understand how rules have been applied, and I'd like to review any public records related to fines or dock access issues." The clerk handed him a folder and directed him to a quiet table in the back. He carefully spread out the documents. There were historical notices, maps of the lake, property records, and old violations. Some of the notices were detailed, specifying exact infractions. Others were vague, leaving room for interpretation. He noticed that several fines had been issued over the years with little explanation, similar to his own situation. The pattern was clear. The lake authority often enforced rules selectively, sometimes ignoring regulations themselves. As he examined the records, he took detailed notes. Every inconsistency, every unclear rule, and every example of selective enforcement could become part of his strategy. He realized that the authorities' power depended on the assumption that people would follow instructions without questioning them. By carefully documenting everything, he could challenge that assumption and turn the tables. Hours passed as he sifted through records, maps, and notices. He discovered interesting details about lake access points, property boundaries, and previous fines. Some docks had been closed for reasons that were unclear, and in several cases fines were overturned after formal appeals. He began to understand that his fine was not unique. The authority had a reputation for being strict and sometimes unfair, but it was not impossible to challenge them. This knowledge gave him confidence and fueled his determination. After gathering all the documents he could, he returned to the cabin. He spread everything out on the kitchen table, creating a clear, organized layout of evidence. Notices, records, photographs, and notes were arranged meticulously. He felt a sense of control that he hadn't felt since receiving the fine. The situation that had once felt overwhelming now seemed manageable. Knowledge had turned fear into power, confusion into clarity. He decided to take the next step, visiting the lake itself to observe. He wanted to see the docks, the signage, and any areas that could be restricted. Walking along the shore, he noticed a few neighbors keeping their distance, perhaps wary of drawing attention from the lake authority. He moved carefully, taking photos of notices, recording dates and times, and observing any unusual activity. Every detail mattered, no matter how small as he walked. He noticed a small group of officials inspecting another dock down the lake. They were checking measurements, looking at paperwork, and making notes. It was clear that the authority took their role seriously, but it also confirmed what he had seen in the records. Enforcement was sometimes arbitrary, inconsistent, and even contradictory. He took careful photographs from a distance, ensuring he had evidence of how rules were applied in practice. Returning to the cabin, he reviewed the photos and notes. Each observation added to the growing picture of the lake authority's operations. He realized that he could use these details to his advantage. If they tried to enforce rules unfairly against him, he would be ready with proof. If they claimed he violated regulations, he could counter with evidence of their own inconsistencies. The more he learned, the more confident he became. That evening, he decided to speak with another neighbor who had lived near the lake for decades. The neighbor welcomed him in, offering tea and a quiet place to sit. They spoke in low tones, sharing stories about past fines, dock inspections, and encounters with the lake authority. Some incidents were minor, others more serious. But a clear theme emerged. Many people had felt the weight of arbitrary enforcement at some point. His fine was not an isolated case. It was part of a larger pattern. He listened carefully, asking questions without revealing too much about his plans. Every detail was valuable. Dates, names, specific incidents, these could all help him build a case if needed. The neighbor even mentioned that some officials had personal biases, favoring certain property owners while penalizing others. This revelation was crucial. It meant that the authorities' actions were not just bureaucratic, they were influenced by opinion and preference, which could be challenged with evidence. By the time he returned to the cabin, night had fallen. The lake reflected the stars like a mirror, calm and serene. He felt a sense of satisfaction mixed with anticipation. The day had been productive, full of discoveries, observations, and new understanding. He had learned more about the authority, their practices, and the patterns of enforcement than he ever imagined possible. This knowledge was his advantage, and he intended to use it wisely. He spent the evening organizing his notes, cross-referencing records, and making detailed summaries. Every inconsistency, every past overturned fine, and every vague notice was carefully documented. He realized that preparation was key. The authority might have assumed he would pay the fine quietly, but he was not going to play by their rules. He was building a foundation, a quiet strategy that would allow him to challenge their power effectively. Late at night, he walked to the dock, looking out over the still water. The moon reflected on the surface, casting a silver glow that made the lake look almost otherworldly. He thought about the coming days, about the careful planning, research, and observation that lay ahead. This was no longer just about a $500 fine, it was about reclaiming control, proving that careful, deliberate action could overcome arbitrary authority. He realized that patience was as important as knowledge. Rushing into confrontation could backfire, but methodical preparation could create opportunities. He made a mental checklist of the next steps: continue researching rules, speak cautiously with more neighbors, document every interaction, and prepare for possible appeals or legal challenges. Every action would be deliberate, every step part of a larger strategy. As he sat on the dock, listening to the gentle lapping of water, he felt a quiet sense of empowerment. The fine had initially felt like a threat, but now it was a catalyst. It had forced him to observe, analyze, and strategize in ways he hadn't anticipated. The lake, once a place of simple relaxation, had become a stage for resilience, intelligence, and careful planning. He understood now that challenges could be opportunities if approached with the right mindset. Before going to bed, he reviewed his notes one final time. He made a list of the evidence he had gathered, the observations he had made, and the insights he had gained. Each point reinforced his confidence. The lake authority might have thought they held power over him, but in reality, knowledge, patience, and strategy were far more powerful. He felt ready for whatever came next. The night was quiet, the lake still reflecting the stars. He fell asleep with a sense of calm determination. The $500 fine had set off a chain of events that would test his patience, intelligence, and persistence. But he knew he was prepared. The groundwork had been laid, and the coming days would be about executing his plan carefully, step by step. The lake was calm, but beneath that calm, he could feel the currents of strategy building, quietly, methodically, and with purpose. The next morning, he woke with a sense of urgency and purpose. Over the past few days, he had gathered information, observed the lake authority, and connected with neighbors who offered pieces of insight. Now, it was time to begin using that knowledge. Today he would move beyond observation. He would start to turn the tables. Carefully, methodically, without rushing, but with the determination of someone who had prepared well. After a quick breakfast, he packed his backpack again, this time with not only notebooks and a camera, but copies of every regulation he had found, every past violation, and every piece of evidence that showed inconsistencies in the lake authority's enforcement. He wanted to have everything at hand, ready for reference if needed. He reviewed his plan one last time before leaving. Visit offices, submit formal requests, document responses, and ensure that every step left a record. This was not a battle of anger or confrontation. It was a battle of preparation, logic, and precision. The drive into town felt different this morning. The sun shone brighter, the air seemed fresher, and for the first time since the fine was issued, he felt a sense of control. He parked near the town hall and walked in, greeting the familiar clerk with a polite nod. Today, he wasn't just browsing records. Today, he would submit formal inquiries, request official clarification, and create a paper trail that would leave no room for arbitrary decisions. He started with the office responsible for lake management. He explained calmly that he was reviewing past violations and regulations, and he formally requested records of fines, access restrictions, and enforcement procedures for the past 10 years. The clerk initially seemed hesitant, but he remained polite and patient, showing that he understood the proper procedures and would follow them precisely. Slowly, the clerk began to gather documents, photocopying records and allowing him to review maps and old notices. Every detail added to the growing body of evidence he was assembling. By late morning, he had compiled a substantial set of documents, records of fines, letters sent to other cabin owners, maps showing docks and restricted areas, and notes on inconsistencies in rule enforcement. As he reviewed the materials, a pattern became clear. Some fines had been overturned due to lack of evidence. Certain docks had been restricted without proper notice. Officials had ignored their own regulations in several cases. This was the leverage he needed. With clear, documented inconsistencies, he could challenge the authority with facts rather than opinions. After leaving the town hall, He visited a local law library to cross-check regulations and historical rulings. He wanted to ensure that any appeal or formal complaint he made would be grounded in legal precedent and supported by documented evidence. Hours passed as he copied relevant sections of rules, noted exceptions, and highlighted points that supported his case. He began to see the bigger picture. The lake authority had rules, but enforcement was inconsistent, selective, and sometimes biased. This knowledge was empowering. Returning to the cabin in the late afternoon, he spread everything out across the kitchen table. Documents, photographs, notes, and observations formed a detailed map of the situation. He could see where the authority had overstepped, where records were inconsistent, and where procedural errors had occurred. He realized that he could turn the fine into a moment of accountability, not just for himself, but for others who had suffered under similar arbitrary decisions. He wasn't seeking revenge and anger, he was seeking justice through preparation and evidence. As evening approached, he drafted formal letters. Each letter was precise, professional, and well documented. He referenced specific rules, pointed out inconsistencies, and included copies of supporting evidence. One letter formally questioned the basis of his fine. Another requested clarification on enforcement procedures, and a third documented violations by officials themselves. Each letter was written calmly, without emotion, designed to create a paper trail that could not be ignored. Once the letters were ready, he reviewed them carefully. He knew that one misstep could undermine all his preparation. Every date, every reference, every fact had to be correct. He double-checked each document, ensuring accuracy and clarity. Satisfied, he sent the letters via certified mail and email, creating undeniable proof that he had formally challenged the fine and requested explanations. The following day, he returned to the lake. Normally, the mornings here were serene, with birds singing and water gently moving against the shore. Today the lake seemed charged with anticipation. He walked along the dock, noting any signs of activity from the authority. To his surprise, some officials appeared to be inspecting areas near other cabins, measuring docks, and reviewing notices. He documented everything with his camera, ensuring he had evidence of their enforcement actions and any inconsistencies in their procedures. Neighbors he had spoken to earlier watched cautiously from a distance. Some whispered about the ongoing situation, while others simply nodded in acknowledgement of his determination. Word had begun to spread that someone was challenging the authority, not with confrontation, but with careful planning and evidence. For the first time, he felt a subtle shift in the power dynamic. Knowledge and preparation had begun to level the playing field as the day progressed. Continued his meticulous documentation. He measured distances, photographed signs, and compared current enforcement practices with historical records. Each detail was added to his growing dossier, which was becoming an irrefutable record of both his compliance and the authorities' inconsistencies. Every observation reinforced his confidence that the fine could be challenged successfully. That evening, he reviewed all materials once more. The doc notices, photos, historical records, and formal letters created a complete picture. He could see exactly how the authority had enforced rules selectively and where procedural mistakes had occurred. He realized that this was more than just a personal battle. It was an opportunity to ensure that the rules were applied fairly and consistently. His preparation had turned a situation that initially felt hopeless into one. Where he held the advantage, he decided to reach out to a neighbor who had legal experience in local matters. The neighbor agreed to review his evidence and offer advice. They met in a quiet cabin near the lake, carefully discussing the documents without attracting attention. The neighbor confirmed that he had strong grounds to challenge the fine. There were procedural errors, inconsistencies in enforcement, and documented cases where similar fines had been overturned. With this confirmation, his confidence grew even stronger. Over the next few days, he continued observing the lake and the authority. He maintained a low profile, documenting every interaction, every notice, and every inspection. He avoided confrontation, focusing solely on collecting evidence and building a solid foundation for his challenge. His patience and methodical approach were paying off. The authorities seemed unaware of the depth of his preparation, continuing their usual inspections and enforcement without realizing that he was quietly gathering everything needed to hold them accountable. By the end of the week, he had compiled a complete case. The evidence was organized, the formal letters were filed, and the observations meticulously documented. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. What had started as a $500 fine had transformed into an opportunity to assert his rights, demonstrate the importance of proper enforcement, and reclaim control over his peaceful sanctuary. The lake, once a place of simple relaxation, had become the stage for his methodical and strategic response. On the following morning, he returned to the dock, taking in the familiar sights of the water and the surrounding trees. The lake seemed calm, almost indifferent to human conflicts, yet he could sense the subtle shift in his own perception. The fine was no longer a threat. It was a challenge that had sharpened his focus, intelligence, and patience. He understood that true power lay not in confrontation but in preparation, observation, and deliberate action. As he looked out over the water, he realized that the lake authority had underestimated him. They had assumed that he would comply quietly, pay the fine, and accept their arbitrary rules. Instead, he had used the situation to gather knowledge, build evidence, and prepare a carefully structured challenge. Every step he had taken was deliberate, designed to protect his rights and expose inconsistencies in enforcement. He felt a sense of quiet triumph, knowing that he had shifted the balance of power without raising his voice. By late afternoon, he drafted one final document, a summary of all findings, clearly outlining each inconsistency, procedural error, and documented observation. This document would accompany his formal appeal, creating a comprehensive record that left no room for doubt. He reviewed it carefully, ensuring that it was clear, factual, and professional. Every detail had been checked, every statement supported by evidence. This was his weapon, not one of anger, but of preparation and clarity. That evening, he placed the document and supporting materials in a secure folder, ready for submission. The lake glimmered in the setting sun, reflecting shades of orange and pink across the water. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the tension of the past week, yet it also symbolized the calm control he now felt. The $500 fine, once a source of frustration and uncertainty, had become the catalyst for a methodical and intelligent response. As night fell, he sat on the porch, sipping tea and reviewing his plan for the coming days. The appeal would be submitted, the evidence carefully presented, and the process closely monitored. He knew that the Lake Authority would not expect such a thorough and strategic challenge. They had relied on assumption, routine, and selective enforcement. He relied on preparation, documentation, and clarity. The balance had shifted, and he felt the satisfaction of quiet empowerment. Before going to bed, he walked to the dock one last time, looking out over the still lake. The water reflected the stars, calm and serene, a reminder of why he had cherished this place for so long. The fine had once threatened to disrupt his peace, but through patience, observation, and careful strategy, he had taken control of the situation. The lake remained his sanctuary, and he had ensured that he would be able to enjoy it on his own terms. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. What had begun as a seemingly impossible problem, a sudden $500 fine, had been transformed into an opportunity to assert his rights, gather knowledge, and prepare for a decisive response. The lake, the dock, and the surrounding woods had borne witness to his careful planning, and he knew that the next chapter would bring the results of his quiet, methodical work. The morning air was crisp. Carrying the scent of pine and fresh water from the lake, he stepped outside, feeling a sense of calm determination. Over the past week, everything had been planned, documented, and executed with precision. What had started as a sudden, confusing $500 fine had become a carefully managed process that he now felt ready to conclude. Today he would see the results of his preparation, and he had every reason to believe that patience and diligence would pay off. He loaded his notes and evidence into his backpack once again, double-checking that every document was in order. There were letters, copies of regulations, photographs, and meticulous notes on every interaction with the Lake Authority. This was not just a response, it was a statement. Every point was supported by facts, and every fact was carefully organized. For the first time, he felt a sense of empowerment that had nothing to do with anger or confrontation. He was calm, focused, and ready. As he drove into town, he noticed the usual quiet streets, the familiar faces of shopkeepers, and the occasional glance from neighbors who had heard about the fine. There was no hostility, just curiosity. Word traveled quickly in small towns. Many people had already begun to recognize that he was taking the situation seriously, methodically, and without panic. That reputation worked in his favor. The Lake Authority would not expect such a well-prepared challenge at the office. He was greeted by a clerk who recognized him from the past week's visits. He smiled politely and asked to speak with Mr. Dalton, the official who had issued the fine. Mr. Dalton appeared slightly surprised to see him again, but he remained professional, offering a neutral nod.